Good afternoon, everyone. I am Deborah Omowale Jarman, the CEO of the San Antonio African American Community Archive and Museum. That applause is not for me, it's for SACAM, just so you know, which deserves the applause. So, newsflash, I am not going to read you the bios of our presenters because that insults your intelligence. But I am going to tell you what I know about them, what's not in your book. Dr. Andrea Roberts is a 7th generation Texan whose ancestors walked here with the Kirkendalls as a part of the original 300. That has to sit for a minute. Her work is rooted in the fact that Black people have been here, and not just in urban spaces. I am truly a fangirl of her work with the Texas Freedom Colonies. As a non-museum studies educated person, when I realized I was going to get the role at SACAM, one of the first things I did was, I've got to learn about Texas because I'm not from here. And lo and behold, I found the website and it was eye-opening. Thank you, Dr. Roberts, for befriending our friends, the descendants of the Wilcox family and the Wilcox Ranch in Jake's Colony, Seguin, Texas. And I am personally grateful for the investment that you've made in your work. Next, we have Paula King Harper, who is a descendant of the Wilson brothers and a keeper of her family's legacy. Now, my notes say Paula's zeal, but zeal is a good word, but when you see her and just the energy that she exudes when she is talking about her family, she's telling the stories. It's just infectious, and I appreciate her so much. She is keeping the memory of the Wilsons alive through the Wilson Pottery Museum, which is housed at the Sebastopol House Museum in Seguin. She also works tirelessly on her family reunions, and she works with the Wilson Pottery Foundation. Sit back and listen to these two beautiful queens share their work with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that generous introduction. I'll be speaking to you today about something called outsider preservation. And I will more specifically be talking to you about the tradition of placemaking and placekeeping among African Americans, particularly in Texas. There we go. So as I mentioned, I'll be talking about African American placemaking practice, especially the role of storytelling and commemoration as a form of both keeping places and making places. And most notably, I'll talk a little about Juneteenth and other commemorative rituals and events that have played an important role in creating communities called Freedom Colonies in Texas after June 19, 1865. So I am more than sure that you have heard several times today the quote-unquote Juneteenth story, but the reason for me illuminating this particular aspect of the story will soon become clear. The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the executive of the U.S., all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves. So we have a proclamation here that would give you the impression that African Americans suddenly have all the same rights that white Americans do. That is the impression that that sentence would give us, correct? the truth of it, we know, becomes apparent in the rest of the statement. And the connection, therefore, heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. And so we see an automatic qualification of the right to movement, the right to decide what to do with one's own time, and even where to spend spare time and where to live. So we see these automatic caveats coming from the beginning, right? We've all read this several times, but I think that it's important to note the automatic limitations built into the statement. And also to understand that June 19th is situated in a number of events that lead us toward freedom, right? So while we have the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, we have the last Confederate command surrendering, May 26, 1865, we have Juneteenth, but we don't have the 13th Amendment ratification in most states until January 1866, and in Texas, we don't have the ratification until 1870. And we all know the journey associated with the creation of first the Texas holiday of Juneteenth and later the introduction of a bill and passage of the federal holiday of Juneteenth. So we see a process here, correct? And we also need to remember the ways in which we move through freedom as African Americans. That is the way that we moved to signal our freedom and to project our freedom and right to move in spite of the limitations placed on us. This is an example of where African Americans spent their time in Texas after Juneteenth. We know that they all gathered in parks and public spaces around the state, and many of which these are spaces that African Americans even pool money to purchase to be able to have these celebrations. But this is particularly interesting to me for a number of reasons, namely that it has some aspects of it that are not what you would normally associate with African Americans, right? So it is a excerpt from Brenham Daily Banner, June 2nd, 1882. And it says, Tobe Williams reports everything working harmoniously in connection with the grand excursion by the colored people to Hackworth's colony in Fort Bend County. On the 19th of June, Emancipation Day, it is now believed that at least 5,000 people will attend that celebration. Houston, Galveston, Richmond, Belleville, Brenham, and many other places on the line of the Santa Fe Railway will be represented. The trip will be pleasant, affording those who go get a chance to see some splendid country. What I want to note here is that they are talking about Hackworth's colony, a freedom colony, and the places that were represented in the freedom colony. They're not talking about Houston and how these rural places are represented at a party in Houston. So, not to say that that didn't happen, but this is illuminating the primacy of free, created black space in the early life of African Americans. They created these spaces so much so that they came from all of those areas to Hackworth's colony, a freedom colony created by formerly enslaved people.
So one day
Before I play this, what I want to also signal is that there are accounts of what Juneteenth was like. And one of these accounts came during the research that I conducted in Freedom Colonies, interviews with individuals who lived most of their life within Freedom Colonies in Deep East Texas, particularly Jasper, Newton County. And this woman, in the course of our many days of conversations, shared this very interesting excerpt about an attempt to hold a Juneteenth celebration.
So one day in the church about an older man. that they had a meeting, and that was down below Hickory Grove Baptist Church. It was on the side of the road there. They made a platform. And they didn't know that the master was going to come to when they signed the emancipation.
Yes.
They didn't know, they built the platform like to celebrate their freedom.
Yes.
But they didn't know that the white folks was coming. And they said my great-great-grandfather, his name was Barry Fowler, said he was supposed to do the talking. And this man said he stood up, and when he stood up, it was so many white folks there, he said, God's certain I can't cut it, and sit down. Because he was afraid of the white folk.
Yes.
He had his speech already made out, the talk. But they couldn't be open because they just gotten free.
So we can learn from that story attempts to create free space out in the open and the ramifications, the terror, the racial terror that inhibited celebrations out in the open. Weirgate, Texas, of course, many of us know was a large timber concern, but was surrounded by historic black settlements. So freedom then is a place and a process. Freedom as a place is associated with abolitionist geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and I think it's appropriate in us thinking about this idea of placemaking. It sounds like a very modern term, right? It's something that a lot of developers and people who work in planning use, but it really is a practice, it's a process, and for African Americans, it's an effort to assert full personhood. The way African Americans create sites of endurance, belonging, and resistance through social interaction is placemaking. It's institution and community building. It's self-governance, particularly in the spaces of their faith communities, which would often be the spaces in which they would both vote and educate their children. And in contemporary framing of placemaking and keeping place, ritualized commemorative practices and spatializing of culture, that's showing up, remembering, and engaging in practices that are directly connected to the origins or beginnings or the founders of that place. It includes physical preservation practice, land stewardship, and that's part of what I witnessed growing up, but I didn't call it all that. This is an image of me enjoying a very good tea cake right outside Fresno, Arcola, Texas, which is now full of suburban homes everywhere, right? But that's me. And the woman who is standing is my great-grandmother, Hester Allen. And the woman who is holding me is her mother, my great-great-grandmother. She was born, we're not absolutely sure, it's 1876 or 1877. This is the most valuable picture I own. And it is so valuable because I can tell people that I touched Reconstruction in my lifetime. And it is valuable also because the way that I got to understand their history is through place, through exploration of place, particularly through cemeteries. So I talked about spaces of jubilation and celebration, but there also are spaces of commemoration, which are our cemeteries. So Hester Allen, when she passed, I was not able to be at her funeral. I was in college, I was away. And I did see her program and noted that there was something called the FIS cemetery. Like that was the name of the cemetery that she was buried in. And long after I went to actually look at the cemetery, it's really creepy. As you know how some of the cemeteries over time, they sink. They look like the places you just don't go to and you pass by it every day. And I finally just stopped one day and walked in and looked around and saw FIS cemetery. I couldn't tell what FIS meant. I said, Grandma Vi, what is FIS? She said, let me go play telephone and see if somebody will eventually tell me what that stands for. And they said, Farmers Improvement Society of Texas. And so the Farmers Improvement Society of Texas was actually the Farmers Improvement Society that had 21,000 members in 3 states. And the founder of that organization, Robert Lloyd Smith, was a protege of Booker T. Washington. And so the women in my family, my grandma Hester Allen was a member, and the way that they were able to afford burial services and to maintain that cemetery was because of their membership in this mutual aid society. And when I began to look into and inquire into the mutual aid society, I learned more about that woman in the middle, Ruby Allen, who owned that car and who owned a shop, or a store rather, that all the people who worked at the Imperial Sugar Refinery in Sugar Land used to go to. And so this organization had a women's auxiliary, right? And that women's auxiliary, this is one of the statements that the women made in terms of what they wanted, what their purpose was. We are after property, new methods, and bank accounts. That sounds like something Beyonce would say. Right? This is 1900, right? These are rural women. These are not your uplift, upper middle class, elite black women. These are rural black women who are determined to figure out how to budget and escape what they called King Cotton, to escape sharecropping. So this was all part of creating and place making, because you can't make a free place until you leave bondage, and you can't leave bondage until you have a financial literacy about how you go and buy bacon in bulk as a community, about how you pull your funds to steward a cemetery. So it was that inquiry of that thinking and starting to map that out that got me very deeply thinking about these places, because the other place where I found information about the Mutual Aid Society was a book called Freedom Colonies by Thad Sitton. And there was a long list of places in the back of that book. But I was first looking at this sort of mapping out where I lived and where I was born, and I was like, this is right under my nose. But when I center the cemetery in it, it makes the story of place look completely different. It's not just about driving down South Main. It's not just about an exodus from the city to the suburbs. These are the stories that you're told about what your landscape is. But I found that that wasn't the story. It's a very incomplete story. So that is what led me to want to think about not just these disparate parts, but about place, about all those landscape features, the cemeteries, the churches, the parks. These are dispersed communities, places unplatted, unincorporated, individually unified only by church and school, and residents' collective belief that a community existed. It's that collective belief part that made me a little bit obsessed with this whole concept. And so one of the things I became determined to do were a few things. One, to find out what's the status of these places, how many still exist, what does it mean to say a place exists? And now I'm going to have to go really fast. And so we do have probably a base understanding of early Texas and slavery. Some of that was just spoken about a few moments ago, about how black codes prohibited African Americans from accumulating publicly available land. We all have some idea of more popular towns and settlements, but what's significant about a lot of freedom colonies is that they were never documented as places for a number of reasons. It was often not safe to make that visible. We have a black placemaking kind of movement timeline. There are a number of threats to the survival of these places that became evident when I began to talk to folks. Ecological vulnerability, access to services, and visibility. But I found in a place called Shankleville, the way that they leveraged their particular story was a way that attracted descendants back and reinforced involvement from as far away as Australia. People came back and invested in preserving their homestead and preserving and stewarding two cemeteries, as well as their church, through new festivals as well as these classical ways of bringing people back. And so this is what I learned and what I began to question. We have foundational stories that foster attachment to place, that encourage participation, that catalyze real planning outcomes. All of that celebration actually ends up in money that saves cemeteries. Like, there are concrete outcomes here. But is it the same everywhere else? So I engaged in a lot of surveying, a lot of interviewing, and all of those practices over 2 years. And what I learned is that there were folks who were dedicated to coming back and who were going to retire there. These are folks from Houston who still go back. And that people were determined to save the anchor institutions, especially the churches and the schools, this historically black school. And these are leaders. These gentlemen, some of them used to run HUD regionally. They're very successful, but what they care about is the home place. And that there were women like this who had complete calendars in their heads of homecomings that made visible the places that no longer are on maps, because this is telling you where people travel, where they go to, where they return to. And all of that was in her memory. She had written all this down. And I learned that our public map was telling us, if I look at what Texas Historical Commission was saying, if I look at what Google was saying, if I look at what that Sitten was saying, there were 14 places. When I spent time there were 34 places. That using all of those methodologies. But I also soon learned that to do all of that for a state would be a little much by myself, right? And so that was how the Texas Freedom Colonies Project was born, which is about connecting with descendants and collecting their placemaking narratives and origin stories, and then using that data to establish where the places are located, and then also using that data to co-create solutions, research solutions to the problems that they're engaging now. And these are just some images of the type of programming that we do. People think, oh, she makes that atlas. I don't make the atlas. Descendants make the atlas, but we really work with descendants to support them in their preservation practice. That's what we actually do. And this is just an example of one of those entries that's showing you the types of place-based information in the entries so that you can get the connection between I'm giving you this information in your survey, it's telling you information about place, it's telling you about what's still active, and it's telling you what's needed. This is the status. So if you were to go online, publicly available, anyone can look, the dashboard tells you this is where we are right now. We have identified 527 historic Black settlements in the state of Texas alone. So thank you, descendants, and every volunteer who is committed to contributing to the atlas. I'm going to skip over that, unfortunately, but that is available online. So I'm going to end with where we are now. So the Texas Freedom Colonies Project has become a model for not only having an atlas online that has a database and that's interactive, but that actually gets descendants to self-identify more with place, to value place, and then also to organize around their issues. And in the course of finding all that, I got more research questions. How do creative commemorative practices activate this larger diaspora of historic Black settlement descendants to document, protect, and regenerate endangered freedom colonies and Black settlements around the country? And how are descendants' practices and needs different based on their geographical and historic context? Virginia, is it like Texas? Is Texas like California? What does centering descendant perspectives in all of that work look like? I'd like to think I was doing it, but when we're talking about practice and education, what does it look like? It looks like these 4 items. So the Outsider Preservation Initiative, which I invite everyone to find a way to get involved with, has 4 goals. I'm based now at the University of Virginia, and my research center is committed to growing the Texas Freedom Colonies Project such that we have a new online portal that's expansive. We have communities of practice, workshops, and symposia that I'd love to co-plan with you, preservation pedagogy, and grants directly to outsider preservationists and artists. What is an outsider preservationist? It's descendants who operate outside of preservation. It's artists who are descendants who operate outside mainstream preservation and art. And we're looking at Virginia, Texas, California, and Louisiana, and North Carolina. Why? Because this was the overland pathway, not pathway, but where if we look at census records, we can trace that pathway. So that's the reason why we're focused on those. This is my first attempt at an East-West meetup, and this is the website. So I want everyone, I'm going to pass out and pass down to all of you note cards, and want you to visit the website, www.outsiderpreservation.com. You'll learn about the initiative, how to apply for money to support your descendant-led preservation projects, to commemorate place, to continue your placekeeping, and to support your work, and to grow together. And with that, I thank you very much.
No. We appreciate the efficiency of the Whitty staff, and I'm just thankful that Ron Davis and Deborah Jarman and the Whitty team have invited Wilson Pottery Foundation to be present with you all on today. I am Paula King Harper, 5th generation descendant of Reverend Hiram Wilson Sr. In 1851, Reverend John McCamey Wilson Jr., a white Presbyterian minister and educator and slave owner, departed from Morgantown, Burke County, North Carolina, and headed west. He and his family and his complement of slaves would settle in Fulton. It's not readily known why Reverend Wilson chose to migrate to Missouri. Maybe it was because it was considered frontier territory and he envisioned a new beginning for himself and his family. Perhaps it was because under the Missouri Compromise, Missouri had been admitted into the Union as a slave state, and other slave owners from the South had begun to migrate there. Or maybe he wanted to contribute to furthering the Presbyterian presence in the territory, as he did establish a seminary and a school for women while he was there. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 nullified the provisions of the Missouri Compromise, and skirmishes and violence immediately erupted in Kansas between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers. The unrest spilled across the border into Missouri, and a peaceful existence for slave owners in Missouri was placed in serious jeopardy. Reverend Wilson, I apologize. Reverend Wilson was quite possibly seeing that his own well-being as a slave owner was becoming more uncomfortable. He left Missouri in 1856 and arrived in Texas. He and his family and his slaves settled in or near Capota in Guadalupe County. Capota was then and is now still a rural community about 11 miles east of the city of Seguin. As big as the state was, it is not known why Reverend Wilson settled there. Did he have advanced information about the area? Did he know someone that already lived there? Or was there another reason? This is Hiram Wilson Sr. and his slave brother, James. They were not, as far as we know, biological brothers. Slaves were known to be leased or deed out as property in wills. Sorry. This is a document mentioning the leasing of an enslaved woman named Jenny for $150 for the remainder of 1863. The lease began in February. The transaction is actually recorded in the Guadalupe Slave Transaction Book, and it says that the hirer was John McCamey Wilson. This 1870 census reveals Wallace, James, and Hiram's families recorded. Also documented on the census is Isaac Suttles, another potter. The records show there were just over 1,700 slaves of African descent in Guadalupe County in the 1860 census. This was a relatively small number compared to the other denser Texas counties. Most Guadalupe County slaves were the property of slave owners who migrated to Texas from other southern states, and they worked crop-yielding fields around the county. The role of Christianity as religion in the life of the African-American slave has been debated for some time. I am inclined to believe that faith is what held families together. Can you imagine from this article, it documents that there were over 250 wagons hauling families and people riding horseback for miles to worship. It's the 21st century and some folks won't even leave their bedside to praise God. Just a little preacher humor. It was God that held the families together. And I wonder what is keeping our families together today. Back to pottery. In the 1800s, the vast majority of Americans lived in rural areas. This was especially true in the southern states. Rural families were self-reliant in that they produced their own food by raising livestock and growing crops. These families needed a way to store and preserve grains, breads, meats, liquids, and the like in containers, and they were handy for daily as well as long-term usage. Many families used stoneware and pottery vessels for this purpose. Pottery making has been an integral part of human civilization for thousands of years. Native Americans were pottery makers before the arrival of the European settlers. Like many other things, the technique of producing pottery from clay soil evolved over the centuries, and the use of kilns and glazes was a part of the revolution. When Reverend Wilson was growing up in North Carolina, earthenware pottery was made at several locations across the state, including Seagrove, that was not far from his birthplace in Mecklenburg County. However, the epicenter for pottery making in America was in South Carolina in an area called the Edgefield District. At Edgefield, the innovative technique of applying alkaline glaze to clay pieces was used for the first time in America. Pottery makers had become a sizable industry there, and the scale of the business dictated that entrepreneurs used slave labor and hired freed African-American laborers to work with the pottery sites. So the question can be asked, did his connection to pottery making in the Carolinas influence his decision to start his own pottery making company at some point? And the answer is probably yes, since he did eventually start his own company in Guadalupe, as the Guadalupe Pottery Company, which was known as Site Number 1. Did he have advanced knowledge before leaving Missouri that the soil makeup in Capota was conducive for making pottery? This is impossible to tell. There is no evidence that Reverend Wilson had pottery making skills of his own, but perhaps the way in which the Edgefield slaves were used was back in his mind, and he decided to use his own slaves in a similar way. Still, it is not clear how or when, but he hooked up with the two skilled potters who had migrated to Texas from the Edgefield district in South Carolina, and they were a white potter named Marion Durham and an African potter named John Chandler. The stoneware shapes and the alkaline glaze were techniques that Reverend Wilson used at his pottery site, and they reflected influences from the Edgefield district brought by Durham and Chandler. As far as we know, only a handful of Reverend Wilson's male slaves were involved in the production of stoneware, pottery vessels at the Guadalupe Pottery Company. Two of them were Hiram and James Wilson, the Wilson family that I will be speaking about today. Research shows that there were other slaves. Wallace, George, and Andrew also worked at the site. However, George and Andrew did not list their occupations as potters in that 1870 United States Census. Not only did they have to learn to create artistry and the necessity to shape individual stoneware pieces, they were exposed to and absorbed the ancillary aspect of the pottery making business, such as suitable clay soil location and selection, seasonal considerations, kiln construction, equipment, tools, procurement, and maintenance, glaze selection, glazing techniques, materials, and inventory. Reverend Wilson's pottery business operated prior to and during the Civil War. When the Civil War ended and enforcement of the Emancipation Proclamation began, most freed slaves found themselves with no viable skills other than working in plantation fields and producing crops for their own slaves. So the vast majority of those slaves became sharecroppers. This was true in Capota as well, but an exception was Reverend Wilson's slaves who were skilled in pottery making. It has been established that 3 separate locations have been identified in rural Capota as being pottery sites worked by Wilson, and they are designated as sites 2 and 3. So here on this map, you have site 1. Is this a pointer? Site 2, site 3. Site 3 is located on the side of FM Road 466, about a mile from Capota Church and Cemetery. The location was identified by Richard Kins, a former Guadalupe County surveyor and architectural steward with the Texas Historical Commission. It was at his suggestion and urging that the Wilson family unite and create a historical foundation purchased a plot of land, and that was Site 3, and that sits on the site, and pursue grants that could be used to restore the site. And thus, the descendants of Hiram James and Wallace Wilson Historical Foundation, doing business as Wilson Pottery Foundation, was established in 1999. The land was purchased by the Wilson Pottery Foundation more than 12 years ago. Reverend Wilson sold his interest in the Guadalupe Pottery Company in 1869, and at the time, Hiram was about 32 years old, James was about 22, and he was one of the oldest, if not the oldest, among Reverend Wilson's pottery-making slaves. He most likely became literate and under Reverend Wilson's tutelage while acquiring the business acumen necessary to run a pottery company from Reverend Wilson and other skilled potters in the area. These are marked H. Wilson pots. Not sure if you can see the stamp there. The year 1869 had significance in Kapota regarding the pottery business. There was actually another spin-off pottery operation that got started about the same time as Hiram's. That second startup was run by Marion Durham, John Chandler, and another white potter named Isaac Suttles. Though both alkaline and salt glaze were used at Reverend Wilson's pottery site, only salt glaze was used at Hiram's site. Storage jars, jugs, crocks, churns, pitchers, and poultry feeders were some of the types of stoneware that were made. The larger vessels were mostly ovoid in shape. Hiram was also known for his horseshoe handle. And this jar, this crock actually, still holds the tie-down wire from when it was used. And you see the drippings of love and usage. Stoneware pieces Hiram's pottery site usually had stoneware pieces made at Hiram's pottery site usually had H. Wilson & Co. stamped or etched externally near the top of each piece to denote that they were produced there. The practice of using this identification mark was one of the innovations applied at Hiram's site, along with the unique rim design, as well as that horseshoe handle, instead of the well-established crescent-shaped handle for heavier vessels. Again, there is a stamp, and you can see the difference in the glazes. Though Hiram Wilson is best known for pottery making, a little-known fact is that he also became a minister. He attended the seminary at Wiley College and was involved in founding and co-founding several schools and churches in the Seguin, Guadalupe County area. After purchasing 100 acres of land in Kapota, Hiram allocated about 100 acres to establishing the Kapota Church and Kapota School in 1872. Also, Kapota Cemetery. Kapota Church, the original Kapota Church, still stands today, but it is currently in need of restoration, and another building has been established, and they still hold worship service there. To the delight of us Wilsons, Richard began excavating one of the Site 3 beehive kilns around 2002. And to Richard's delight, he had the opportunity to provide tours to the site, excavation to student groups, researchers, historians, the news, media, journalists, and yes, to Wilson family members. Unfortunately, the site excavation exploits did not have the happiest of endings. Our foundation has kept close liaisons with the archaeology and anthropology professors at UTSA, Texas State University, UT Austin, and historians at the Texas Historical Commission. More than one archaeological professor informed us that the archaeological excavations are performed for scientific research reasons, and they always entail cataloging discovered artifacts found and collecting detailed field notes. Once an excavation has begun, ways to preserve and conserve the digs must be in place. And the beehive kiln at Site 3 was exposed to wind and rain and the elements, and therefore was exposed to gradual erosion, which over time would destroy the essence of the excavation. so we were advised to backfill everything without delay. A backfill date was set, and the occasion was highlighted by a ceremony which archaeology students with media and family members were in attendance. And this was the backfill photo from 2003. Wilson pottery can be found in museums across Texas, such as the Bob Bullock Museum, Museum Fine Arts Houston, Bayou Bend Collection, and others. Oh, and the Smithsonian. The descendants of Hiram James and Wallace Wilson gather together every 3 years for a family reunion held in Seguin, keeping traditions close. In 2009, the city of Seguin sponsored for the first time the Pecan Fest Heritage Days, which is a citywide event that combined the individual festivals, celebrations, and community events into one weekend event. The Wilson Pottery Show is a participant in the annual citywide event, and the Wilson Pottery Museum was opened in the Sebastopol House in 2013. The Wilson Pottery Show was moved from downtown to the grounds of the Sebastopol, and the reason for doing so was to provide Pottery Show visitors with the opportunity to visit the museum as well as the Pottery Show. At the 2022 Pottery Show, a divinely timed moment occurred. I was aware that the great-granddaughter of John McCamey Wilson would be coming from Austin. What we were not aware of was one of the collectors at the Pottery Show, via transmission of another collector, found this pot and had purchased it, and he would be handing over the pot at the show, and they made us aware of it. The photographer happened to be on site just in the moment and captured John McCamey Wilson descendants, James Wilson descendants, and Hiram descendants. And so we all were touching history together. Also donated on that day, this is an actual handle from the first site, which is the Guadalupe Pottery Company, and this is a board member, Ken Smith, comparing the handle to an actual poster from the Museum Fine Arts Houston, which was donated to us, identifying that it is indeed a first sight handle. You never know what's going to happen at a Wilson Pottery Show. This was our opening from the Wilson Pottery Museum back in 2013. We were blessed to have Texas State University students to assist us getting everything together. This is the late Joe Reed and the late Laverne Britt, founder of Wilson Pottery Foundation, along with students. Other photos from our opening. We have some talented family members. The Wilson Pottery Gala is an event that is held annually as a spring fundraiser. The gala is one of our foundation fundraising events, and a silent auction is also held. This is from some of our early foundation gala days. We like to get dressed up just a little bit and have some fun. However, this year was our first ever Future Pioneer Awards, where the youth of the family were nominated by their elders, and nominees were selected to receive this first Future Pioneer Awards. We had Lawrence Sampleton, former Philadelphia Eagles, as our guest who presented the awards to the members, and we also annually have the Wilson Potters Award for individuals, whether they are family members or members in the community who support the foundation mission. These are our board members, or our board of directors for 2022 to 2025, and this is our presentation. Are there any questions? I believe Dr. Andrew is coming up, and we're going to have a Q&A. Oh, I'm getting ahead of the game.
So it is time for questions. We have just a few minutes, so here are the rules. There is one question per person. It is a question. It is not a commentary. It is a question. So, Jill. Yes, I believe we can hear you. Dr. Roberts, we'll pass those out for you. We can pass those out for you.
My question is actually for Dr. Roberts. There was a recent article in Texas Monthly magazine about I think they're called freehold land that, I'm not going to describe it well, but it was land that had been granted to former slaves that has been passed down generations, but there's no deed because there wasn't the right paperwork or something, and there's some unscrupulous business people trying to come and take the land from the families. And so I'm wondering if you can comment on that, or maybe explain it better than I just have, because I failed. But
I don't know that you failed. Can you hear me? Okay. You did not fail in the sense that, 70% of all African-American owned land, particularly rural land, is held intestate because of the lack of access to legal family, services to draw up wills. The fundamental reason is heir property. That is I think the phenomena that you're describing. I literally had an email today from yet another person dealing with this issue, which is why on our website, I will just go to the solution, is that we need to advocate for and invest more in legal services. We have a list on the Texas Freedom Colonies Project website. If you go to the section, it's called Black Land Resources, and it has a list of legal aid societies and legal clinics associated with universities. So if you run into people with these issues, you can refer them there to try to find legal services. It's a big problem, it's a big issue, and it's very much rooted in the fact that people could not necessarily get what's called preemption or squatters' rights, right? It just wasn't possible. And it was also difficult to get the legal services to subdivide the land and all of those things that a lot of people just take for granted. But it's kind of a systemic problem that requires a remedy, and it's also rooted in white supremacy, frankly, that we were not able to declare and document land ownership. So try to help as we can.
This is for Dr. Roberts. I noticed, I'm very familiar with your project with the Freedom Colonies out of Texas, and I'm wondering if this new initiative that you have is in essence allowing the same thing from other states.
That's a good question, because I did go through that quickly. What we are trying to do is to, rather than say, let's just copy the atlas and do it in one state at a time, is to instead say, how are descendants doing this work of remembering their stories? How are they doing it? Rather than, hey, come here and fill this in, how do we learn how they're doing it? And the way we're going to learn how they do this work in their historic Black settlements is by incentivizing them to share case studies with us. And the best way to incentivize things is just giving some people some cash to support specifically any kind of artistic, expressive, creative project that causes people to return, like the great examples that you showed today. Like that, if you're like, what does it look like? It looks like everything she just showed you. That's outside of preservation work right there. It was everything. Like I just want to take you in. So, does that answer your question? Okay. We have 5 minutes.
I thought everybody could hear. I guess another part of that too, I'm looking at my family, and whatever the other lady said about the the land being lost because of that air property stuff and all. And so that's something that we definitely have been looking at family property in Louisiana. And that's when I became interested in your project as well. So if we were to start to document this process then from this point forward, is that kind of what you're talking about on this outside?
Okay, let me get specific to your concern. Is what I'm hearing from you is, how are we going to remedy this land issue, right? And what does all of this documentation stuff in the preservation world have to do with that? And to keep it succinct, I would say that on the local level, that the creation of historic districts, okay, which are types of landscapes, but the historic districts, they slow down demolition. They say this is what kind of land uses are permissible. It says this is what you can and can't do here. This is what you can and can't build here. That is how you begin to at least control the character of the place in the land, right? So that's one piece of it. Another whole piece of it, there's a woman named Ebony Alexander who's based in North Carolina, and she runs something called the Black Land Trust, and she has a number of counseling and workshops that are specifically how to go and work with families to talk about some of the underlying issues that help with trying to subdivide, organize, talk about access, taxes, because it's not only, it's a lot of technical, but it's also a lot of relationship. It's relational, right? And so I would say, think about how much you're interested in protecting a place, and then so you can think about the historic preservation piece, and we can assist with you if you have a proposal for everyone coming back and wanting to learn and that kind of thing. But the other piece of it is getting that legal assistance and then getting support from people who do the hands-on work with families.
You gave me an idea for a question. So thank you for all the inspiring advice and modeling for us. I feel really energized by all of the stories and examples you offered. I'm curious if you have advice around the kind of sticky tensions of working with municipal public spaces. We've kind of found quite a bit of difficulty wrapped up in municipal politics and like the bureaucracy of rededicating sites and that are owned by the city. Curious if you have any insight or stories to share around navigating that sometimes complicated and drawn out process.
Did you have anything to share about that at all? So I would just say this, every city and town is different, but I would say that there are organizers and really brilliant people in working on commemoration work in Quakertown, in Denton. And they've been able to do some outstanding work in cooperation with the city, even using economic development tools that you don't normally associate with preservation and try to apply it in their context. So I would look up, there's, I can't remember the name of the reverend right now who leads a lot of efforts there, but Quakertown and the descendants of Quakertown are an example of people who are figuring that out and trying new things, and have a lot of white allies and a lot of people in a lot of different places working on it. So I would suggest, and if you can't remember, if you want to, get my card and follow up later, I can connect you.
So I got to ask, I'm not going to leave one person at the mic, so please ask your question.
I promise it's fast. So I was just wondering if y'all, and the answer might be go sit down and look at the website, but are y'all utilizing any like ArcGIS or anything to?
That is what the atlas is.
Okay.
It
well,
is an
so it
Esri
is sit
project.
down and look at the website.
Yeah, so a lot of you, if you're educators, whatever, it's Esri story map. That's the basis for the product, but not everybody has access and can use that, and so that's why we went to Mellon and said, just give us some money so we could build something else. So that's what we're looking at, what the something else will be over the next 2.5 years. But for now, yes, that's what it all is.
Can I actually piggyback to your answer to this young man? So I noticed that presence is making a difference. We might not be able to overcome all of the municipal obstacles, but presence does make a difference. And sometimes it is a major sacrifice to be present. You might have to drive a distance to be present. You might have to sacrifice your time to be present, but presence makes a difference.
Thank you. Let's give it up for these two beautiful queens. Yes. All right, so next is the Black Cowboy exhibition and tour. And I believe we are reconvening at 6:30, Ron? 6 for our keynote of the evening, Annette Gordon-Reed. And yes, there's food. Thank you all.